The maintenance log had been sitting in his truck for 11 years, 247 entries. Every crack, every load reading, every load bearing variance Daniel Marsh had flagged on the Callaway Tower job, back when the building was still going up, back when he still carried federal credentials and a government badge, and the kind of authority that made construction foremen go quiet. He hadn't opened it in years. He opened it the morning of the TechCore Capital signing. Because something in the announcement didn't add up, and Daniel Marsh had spent 20 years of his life knowing what a number that didn't add up looked like, and what happened to the people who ignored it. This is a story about a man who walked into one of the most powerful corporate lobbies in Chicago carrying a worn log book and his 7-year-old son. He was thrown out before he could say 3 sentences. Nobody in that room knew who he used to be. Nobody knew what was written on page 41. If you stay until the end, you'll see what happens when one quiet man refuses to be dismissed twice. If you've ever watched someone get dismissed before they could finish speaking, stay with me, because what happened next emptied the room. The lobby of TechCore Capital Group occupied the entire ground floor of the Meridian building on Wacker Drive. 3 stories of open air. Glass so clean it looked like the walls had been replaced with sky. The kind of lobby that said money before you read a single sign. Daniel pushed through the revolving doors with Jonah's hand in his. The boy was 7, dark-eyed, quiet, wearing a blue puffer coat that was one size too big because Daniel had bought it to last 2 winters. He had an inhaler clipped to his belt loop. He carried a small backpack with a dinosaur on it because he refused to leave it at home. "It's cold in here," Jonah said. "Buildings like this keep the air cold on purpose." Daniel kept his eyes moving, scanning the lobby. Makes people feel like they're thinking clearly. Does it work? Not always. His voice was even. His hands were not. The logbook was under his arm, wrapped in a rubber band, the laminated safety card tucked inside the front cover. The book was water-stained at the bottom corner from a job site flood in 2017. The spine was cracked. It looked like the kind of thing you'd find in a truck's glove compartment, not the kind of thing you'd carry into a deal worth $500 million. That was the point. Nobody would see it coming. The reception desk was long and white, staffed by a young woman with a headset and the polished patience of someone who screened people for a living. "Can I help you?" Her eyes went to Daniel, to Jonah, back to Daniel, to the logbook. "I need to see Renata Voss." Daniel's voice was level. "It's about the Callaway Tower acquisition." The receptionist's expression didn't shift. "Ms. Voss is unavailable. She's in a closed session. The signing's at 2 o'clock. It's 11:40. I need 15 minutes before that. Do you have an appointment?" "No, I'm sorry. Ms. Voss doesn't take walk-ins." "I understand that." Daniel set the logbook on the counter, not aggressively, just set it down. "If she signs the Callaway acquisition without seeing what's in here, she's going to own a building that can't legally be occupied." The receptionist looked at the logbook the way people look at something they've decided not to touch. "Sir, I'll need to ask you to. The structural load assessments from the 2013 build are incomplete." Daniel kept his voice quiet, flat, factual. The northeast-bearing wall on floors 6 through 9 was flagged during construction, and the corrections were never verified. If those deficiencies weren't remediated, the occupancy certificate is invalid. The asset she's buying is worth nothing. A pause. "I understand," the receptionist said, and then she picked up her phone. Daniel thought she was calling upstairs. She was calling security. 2 men came from the side corridor. Not rushing. The unhurried walk of people who did this 6 times a day and found it boring. One was older, thick-necked, with a corporate ID on a lanyard. The other was younger, sharper-eyed, already positioned slightly behind Daniel's left shoulder. "Sir." The older one gestured toward the doors. "I'm going to need you to come with me." Jonah pressed against Daniel's leg. "I have documented safety findings about the property your CEO is about to purchase." Daniel didn't raise his voice. "That's not a threat, that's a fact. All I'm asking is for someone to look at the documentation before, sir. Now." Daniel looked at Jonah. The boy was watching the security guards with the careful attention of a child who'd seen his father get into a difficult situation before and learned to read the room. He crouched down. "Hey." He kept his voice low and steady. "Everything's okay. These men are going to walk us out. We're going to go wait outside." Did you do something wrong? Jonah asked quietly. No, but sometimes when you tell people something they don't want to hear, they make you leave before you can finish. Jonah thought about this. That doesn't seem fair. It's not, Daniel straightened. Come on. The security guards walked them to the revolving doors, not rough, just present, the quiet machinery of corporate order moving a problem toward the exit. They were halfway across the lobby. Ms. Voss. Daniel said it loud enough to carry. The lobby didn't freeze, it didn't work the way it did in movies, but heads turned. The receptionist looked up. The younger security guard stepped closer. And near the far bank of elevators, a woman in a dark charcoal suit turned. Renata Voss was 44. She'd been profiled in Crane's Chicago Business twice and photographed for the Tribune the day TechCore crossed the $2 billion mark. She moved the way people moved when they'd never had to slow down for anyone. Fast, purposeful, a coffee in one hand and a phone pressed to her ear. She ended the call. Her eyes went to Daniel, to Jonah, to the security guards flanking them, to the logbook under Daniel's arm. What is this? Nothing, the older guard said. Gentleman was just leaving. I have documentation about structural deficiencies in Callaway Tower. Daniel spoke directly to her. 11 years old, filed during the original construction phase. The northeast load-bearing assessments on the 6th through 9th floors were never signed off. If that work wasn't completed, the building's occupancy certificate has no legal standing. Renata Voss studied him. Not the way the receptionist had, not with discomfort or uncertainty, with the cool calculation of a woman who'd been pitched nonsense 100 times and knew how to identify it in under 30 seconds. Who are you? My name is Daniel Marsh. I was the senior safety inspector on the Callaway Tower project from 2012 to 2014. And you came here today with your son. Her eyes moved to Jonah, back to Daniel. I couldn't get anyone to return my calls. Because we don't take calls from contractors with walk-in complaints the morning of a major acquisition. Her voice was precise, not cruel, just exact. This is a disruption tactic. Someone's trying to delay the signing. No one sent me. They never do. She looked at the older guard. Get him out. If he comes back, call CPD. Daniel held up the logbook. Page 41, he said. Load variance on the northeast bearing wall. I flagged it twice. The correction order was issued. The verification record doesn't exist in the public filings. Renata Voss had already turned back to the elevators. The guard's hands came down on Daniel's arms. Not hard, just final. Jonah stayed close, silent, holding the strap of his backpack with both hands. And that was when the elevator doors opened. A man stepped out. He was in his 70s. Silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that made Renata's look like business casual. He moved slowly, deliberately, with the settled weight of someone who'd stopped needing to hurry a long time ago. He saw the security guards. He saw Daniel and Jonah. He saw Renata already halfway to the other elevator bank. He stopped. Renata. His voice was quiet, but Renata Voss stopped. Philip. Her voice changed, just slightly. I was just about to come up. Philip Hartley, TechCore Capital's founding chairman, 80% of the company's institutional memory, looked at Daniel. What's your name, son? Security still had Daniel's arms. He didn't try to pull free. Daniel Marsh, he said. I was the senior FAA licensed safety inspector on Callaway Tower. I have documentation about a structural discrepancy that was never resolved. I tried to reach legal counsel, the acquisition team, and Ms. Voss's office for 3 weeks. No one responded. Philip Hartley looked at the logbook. He looked at Jonah. He looked at Renata. Let him go, he said. The guards released Daniel's arms. Renata Voss turned back. Her jaw was set. Philip, this is a delay tactic, maybe. He was already walking toward Daniel. But if there's documentation about a structural deficiency in the asset we're about to buy for $470 million, I'd like to see it before I sign anything. He held out his hand. May I? Daniel handed over the logbook. Philip Hartley opened it, found page 41 without being told where to look. Read for 45 seconds. Then he looked at Renata Voss. Get the legal team down here, he said. The quiet that followed had weight. 3 hours before Daniel Marsh walked into TechCore Capital's lobby, he'd been on the roof of a 6-unit apartment building in Pilsen, replacing a section of flashing that had been leaking since September. That was the job now. Handyman work. Building maintenance. He had 4 clients in Chicago's South and West neighborhoods, landlords who wanted things fixed right the first time and didn't ask for invoices in triplicate. He carried tools in a canvas bag he'd owned since 2009. He drove a white truck with 140,000 miles on it. It wasn't the life he'd planned. He'd graduated third in his class from the University of Illinois engineering program in 2001. Spent a year with a structural consulting firm in Springfield before a recruiter from the Federal Aviation Administration reached out about a regional inspector position. The work was precise, regulated, and deeply unglamorous. Daniel spent his days in half-built structures looking at load-bearing calculations and signing documents that said the numbers checked out. He loved it, not for the prestige. There was no prestige, not for the money. There was barely any money. He loved it because the work was honest. You looked at a wall. You looked at the drawings. You ran the numbers. Either they matched or they didn't. Either the building was safe or it wasn't. Nobody's feelings were involved. For 11 years he was good at the job. Then his wife Karen got sick. The illness was swift and devastatingly expensive. The treatment required specialists in Milwaukee, which meant weeks away from Chicago, which meant requesting a transfer to a different region. The FAA doesn't do personal transfers easily. The paperwork stalled. The treatment timeline didn't wait for paperwork. He took a leave of absence. He never went back. By the time Karen passed 2 years after diagnosis, when Jonah was 4, Daniel was behind on everything. Mortgage savings, the secondary insurance policy he'd been paying into for 12 years. The house went back to the bank 8 months after the funeral. He and Jonah moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport. He picked up handyman work because it paid fast and he could bring Jonah to the job sites when school was closed. He still had his credentials. His FAA inspector's license was current through 2026. He'd renewed it on instinct, the same way you renew a passport you don't know if you'll use. He hadn't used it in 7 years, until 3 weeks ago. He'd been eating lunch in the truck, listening to the radio, when the news segment came on about TechCore Capital's planned acquisition of the Callaway Tower complex. Commercial real estate in the West Loop, $470 million, due diligence complete, signing scheduled for early November. Daniel had set down his sandwich. He knew Callaway Tower. He'd spent 18 months inside it. He'd flagged a problem on the northeast-bearing wall during the 2013 phase of construction. Submitted the correction order through the proper channels. The order had been acknowledged. The remediation plan had been submitted by the contractor. But the verification record, the sign-off document confirming the corrective work had actually been performed, had never appeared in the public filings. Daniel had checked at the time, assumed it was an administrative delay, and then been pulled off the project for his own family reasons. He'd meant to follow up. He never had. For 7 years he'd thought about it occasionally, told himself someone else had caught it, told himself the building was occupied, had been occupied for years, so clearly the issue had been resolved, but the logs were still in his truck. He'd pulled them out the night the news segment ran, and on page 41 in his own handwriting was the flagged discrepancy. He'd called TechCore's legal department the next morning. No response. He'd called the acquisition team. No response. He'd called the main corporate line 3 times over 2 weeks, trying to reach anyone with authority over the deal. Voicemail. Voicemail. A polite assistant who took his name and said someone would call him back. No one called. The signing was in 4 days. He looked at Jonah's inhaler on the kitchen counter, thought about the specialist appointment scheduled for next month. The bill from the last one still sitting in the kitchen drawer, the number at the bottom circled in red because he was still figuring out how to pay it. He couldn't afford a lawyer. He couldn't afford to be dismissed at a front desk. What he could do was show up. The conference room on the 38th floor was designed for intimidation and dressed up as hospitality. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the river. The table seated 14. There were water glasses and legal pads, and the kind of chairs that said whoever sat in them was supposed to feel important. Daniel sat at one end with Jonah beside him. Jonah had been given a yellow legal pad and a pen, and was drawing what appeared to be a triceratops fighting an elevator. Philip Hartley sat across from Daniel. Renata Voss stood at the window. 3 other people were at the table. Margaret Song, TechCore's general counsel, a woman in her 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain. Kevin Aldrich, head of acquisitions, who'd been on a call when they walked in and ended it the moment Philip entered. And a younger attorney whose name Daniel hadn't caught, who was typing on a laptop with the focused intensity of someone documenting everything. "Walk me through it," Philip said. Daniel opened the logbook to page 41. Callaway Tower, Northeast Quadrant, floors 6 through 9. This section was part of a 2013 redesign that expanded the building's footprint 3 meters to the east. The redesign required additional reinforcement on the bearing wall at those levels because the new configuration shifted load distribution. Margaret Song was looking at her own documents. "We have the structural completion certificate." "I know you do." Daniel kept his voice level. "But the completion certificate covers the overall structure. What it doesn't address specifically is the corrective work order for this section. The contractor, Halloway Bryant, submitted a remediation plan in September 2013. I approved the plan, but the verification record confirming the work was executed doesn't appear in the public filing." Kevin Aldrich leaned forward. "Buildings have been occupied for 9 years. Yes. If there was a structural problem, something would have happened by now." "Not necessarily." Daniel looked at him directly. "Load-bearing deficiencies in commercial construction don't always manifest as catastrophic failure. They can be gradual micro-cracking in the concrete core, slow degradation in the bearing capacity over years. It depends on load patterns, how the space is used, what weight distribution looks like on those floors." He paused. "I'm not saying the building is about to fall down. I'm saying the correction was ordered, the work was supposed to happen, and there's no record that it did. Before you transfer $470 million for this asset, you need to know whether it did or didn't." Silence. Philip looked at Margaret Song. "Do we have documentation from the contractor about that specific correction?" Margaret Song was already rifling through a folder. "We have the Halloway Bryant sign-off on the completion package." "That's the general completion," Daniel said. "The correction order for this specific section would have been a separate filing under a different reference number." He wrote it on the legal pad. "B 2013-4471-NE, that's what you're looking for." The young attorney typed, stopped, typed again. "It's not in our due diligence package," he said. Kevin Aldrich's jaw tightened. Renata Voss still hadn't moved from the window. "It could be an administrative gap," she said without turning. "Missing from the package doesn't mean missing from reality. The contractor would have records." "Yes," Daniel said, "they would, so we call them." Halloway Bryant dissolved in 2018. Their records were transferred to a Chicago archives firm. It took me 6 days to locate them. If you want those records, it's going to take more than a phone call." Renata turned from the window. She looked at Daniel the way she'd looked at him in the lobby, the same assessment, the same measured silence. But something had changed in it. The certainty was still there, but underneath it something had shifted. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want you to delay the signing until you can verify the remediation record. That's it. We have a seller who will walk if we push the timeline. Then you need to make a decision about whether owning a building with a disputed safety record is worth keeping that seller happy." Renata's eyes went to the logbook, to the page covered in Daniel's handwriting. Then to Jonah, who had finished his triceratops and was now drawing what appeared to be a second triceratops attacking the first one from above. "How old is your son?" she asked. The question surprised Daniel. 7, she nodded once, said nothing, turned back to Philip Hartley. "I need the room," she said. Philip stood. Margaret Song and Kevin Aldrich gathered their papers. The young attorney closed his laptop. Daniel started to stand. "Not you," Philip said. He set a hand briefly on Daniel's shoulder as he passed. "Stay there." They came back 20 minutes later. All of them. Philip, Renata, Margaret, Kevin. Plus a new face, a thin man in his 60s who moved like someone who'd spent a lot of time on job sites and hadn't entirely gotten it out of his system. He was introduced as Ward Ellison, a structural engineer TechCore used for technical due diligence. Ward Ellison sat down across from Daniel, opened the logbook to page 41, and read it without speaking for 3 full minutes. "What's your background?" he said finally. "Senior Inspector, FAA Midwest Region, 2004 to 2015. Licensed Structural Safety Assessor through Illinois Department of Commerce. I ran site inspections on 11 major commercial builds in Chicago and northwestern Indiana. Ward Ellison looked up at him over the logbook. I know your name, he said. Daniel waited. You signed the Lakewood Center project in 2011, the one where you caught the rebar spacing violation. Yes, they were going to bury it. The contractor wanted to pour the foundation and move on. Ward closed the logbook carefully. You held the project for 3 weeks while they raided the entire basement level. The spacing was 12% below tolerance. Someone could have died. Ward set the logbook on the table. If the B 2013-4471 any correction wasn't completed, he said slowly, what are we looking at? On floors 6 through 9, load-bearing capacity in the northeast quadrant is potentially compromised. In practice, for a building in normal commercial use, it's probably fine. But if you're signing on a building that's about to undergo renovation or tenant build-out on those floors, which is part of the development plan, right? Yes, Kevin Aldrich said quietly. It is. Then you're looking at a scenario where increased load on already potentially compromised floors creates real risk. And because the correction was never officially closed, the occupancy status for that specific section is legally questionable. The room was quiet. Jonah had finished his second triceratops. He was now very carefully drawing a small human figure between the two dinosaurs, presumably for scale. He hadn't looked up in 20 minutes. Renata Voss was looking at Daniel. We pull the due diligence records for that specific reference number, she said, and they show the work was completed. Will you sign off? Daniel looked at her. If the work was done correctly and the records confirm it, I'll put my name on it. Your name carries weight. It carries legal standing. I'm still licensed. You're a handyman in Pilsen. I'm a licensed FAA structural safety assessor who does handyman work in Pilsen. Something crossed her face. Brief, almost imperceptible. She turned to Ward Ellison. How long to get the Halloway Bryant records? If they're in the Chicago archives system and properly indexed, 48 hours. And if they're not, longer. Renata looked at Philip Hartley. He was watching her with the patient expression of someone who'd built a company by knowing when to push and when to wait. We delay the signing, she said. It wasn't a question. Philip nodded. I'll call the seller's counsel. She reached for her phone. Then she stopped. She looked at Daniel one more time. Why? She said. You haven't worked in the industry in 7 years. Nobody would have known you had this information. You could have watched the sale happen, watched it become someone else's problem. Why come here? Daniel thought about Jonah beside him. About Karen, who'd worked in an office building not so different from this one, who trusted that the places she spent her days were what they said they were. About 18 months of his life spent inside Callaway Tower, learning every wall of it and the nagging thing he'd never quite stopped thinking about. Because I signed my name to that building, he said. I signed my name, and if that correction was never made, then my signature is sitting on a document that says something is true when it might not be, and I'm not willing to let that stand. Renata held his gaze for a long moment. Then she made the call. The signing was postponed. That was the polite word for it. What it actually meant was 14 months of deal-making, 2 rounds of price negotiation, 4 rounds of due diligence, and a seller who'd been planning to close on a Tuesday afternoon were suddenly sitting in open water with no timeline. The seller's counsel called back inside 20 minutes. The conversation, which Daniel was not in the room for but which Kevin Aldrich relayed to him afterward with the flat affect of a man who'd been awake since 5 in the morning, went approximately as follows. The seller expressed deep displeasure. The seller suggested the postponement was a negotiating tactic. The seller threatened to put the property back on market. Renata, by all accounts, did not raise her voice, did not issue counteroffers, and did not explain herself beyond the words structural review pending, at which point the seller's counsel asked how long the review would take, and Renata said she didn't know. The seller did not immediately walk. That was the first thing. The second thing was the archives. The Halloway Bryant records were located at a commercial document storage facility in Cicero. Margaret Song dispatched 2 paralegals at 2:30 in the afternoon with explicit instructions and authority to access whatever they needed. Ward Ellison went with them. Daniel stayed. He wasn't sure why. Renata hadn't dismissed him. Philip Hartley had poured him coffee, looked at Jonah's drawings with what appeared to be genuine interest, and asked him where he'd gone to school. Jonah had eaten a granola bar from his dinosaur backpack and fallen asleep in his chair somewhere around 3 o'clock. Daniel sat with the sleeping boy and watched the Chicago skyline go gray as the afternoon wore on. At 4:15, Kevin Aldrich appeared in the doorway. "We've got a problem," he said. The B-2013-4471 NE correction order existed. That was the first thing the paralegals found in the Holloway Bryant records. 40 pages of documentation confirming that the correction plan had been drawn up, approved, and assigned to a subcontractor named Belfield Construction. What they could not find, what wasn't in the Holloway Bryant records at all, was the completion verification. The work had been assigned. The materials had been ordered. There were invoices from Belfield Construction for labor and concrete and reinforcement hardware totaling just under $200,000, but there was no sign-off, no inspector's report, no final verification. Ward Ellison called from Cicero. "The paper trail ends with the materials delivery," he said. "I can see what Belfield ordered. I can see what Holloway Bryant paid them, but there's nothing here confirming the work was done. No completion document, no inspection record." Kevin put the call on speaker. Renata was very still. "Is it possible it exists somewhere else?" she asked. "A different filing." "It's possible," Ward said. "But if it does, no one's filed it with the city. I checked the permit records before I drove out here. There's nothing under that reference number in the city system. So either the work was done and nobody documented it," Kevin said, or it wasn't done," Daniel said. Everyone in the room looked at him. "I know you don't want that to be true." He kept his voice level. "But it's the only other option. Belfield ordered materials. Holloway Bryant paid them, and there's no completion record anywhere. Either someone forgot to file it, which is possible but unusual for a correction order of this scope, or the work was invoiced and not performed." Renata sat down. She didn't look shaken, but something in her posture had changed. The forward momentum that she'd been running on all day had shifted into something more careful. "We need to inspect the building," she said. "You need a licensed inspector to do it." She looked at Daniel. He looked back. "I'll do it," he said. "But I'm going to need access to floors 6 through 9, and I'm going to need to open the wall." "Open the wall." "Visual inspection from the exterior won't tell you anything. The bearing assembly is inside the wall. I need to see it. That's a construction project. It's a core sample and a section cut. 2 hours, maybe 3. It's the only way to know for certain." Renata looked at Philip. Philip was watching Daniel. "You'll need equipment," Philip said. "I have contacts. I can get what I need." "Tonight, I can make calls," Philip nodded. "Do it," Renata said. The calls took until 9 that evening. Daniel's former colleague at the FAA, a man named Rodrigo who'd retired to consulting work and was perpetually irritated about something, agreed to loan the equipment on 2 conditions: that Daniel buy him dinner the following week, and that Daniel not describe what he was doing as borrowing, because the last person who described it that way had not returned $3,000 worth of sampling equipment, and Rodrigo was still angry about it. The building access was arranged through Margaret Song, who called the Callaway Tower Property Management Company and explained the situation in terms that were accurate but also implied that failing to cooperate would result in legal complications too tedious to describe. Jonah slept in the back of Daniel's truck during all of this, wrapped in a blanket from behind the seat, his dinosaur backpack tucked under his head. They arrived at Callaway Tower at 10:15. Ward Ellison was already there, waiting at the service entrance with a hard hat and a flashlight and the expression of a man who'd had a long day and expected it to get longer. "You do this kind of thing often?" Ward asked. "Used to," Daniel said. "Your kid's in the truck. He's asleep." "You sure about that?" Daniel looked at the truck. Through the back window, he could see Jonah's sneakers sticking out from under the blanket. "I'll check in every 30 minutes. Ward looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. "Let's go." They found what Daniel had hoped they wouldn't find: On the 8th floor, northeast quadrant, behind what was currently a conference room wall in the offices of a mid-sized law firm that had no idea they were working 12 feet from an engineering problem, Daniel's core sample pulled clean concrete where reinforced concrete should have been. He stood and looked at it for a long time. Then he called Ward over. Ward crouched, examined the sample, ran his own measurements. He stood up. They didn't do the work, he said. Daniel already knew, but hearing it said made something in his chest go tight. Belfield invoiced Halloway Bryant for $200,000 of remediation work, he said, and instead of doing it, they pocketed the money. And Halloway Bryant, Ward said, probably knew. They dissolved 4 years later, convenient. Very. Ward turned slowly, looking at the exposed wall section. This building has been occupied for 9 years. The original structural design had margin. The expansion reduced that margin. For 9 years of normal commercial use, it held. Daniel looked up at the ceiling. If TechCore had bought it and started the tenant build-out on these floors the way their development plan shows, they'd have been adding 6 to 8% more load to an already margined section. Eventually, it fails. Eventually. They looked at each other in the quiet of the empty conference room at 11 o'clock at night. "I'll write the report," Daniel said. He wrote it in the truck by the dome light with Jonah asleep behind him. He wrote it the way he'd always written them, factual, specific, reference to the exact documentation, free of language that could be interpreted either way. The words said what the evidence said, nothing more. He attached the core sample photographs Ward had taken. He referenced the missing B 2013-4471 NE verification record. He cited the materials invoices from Belfield Construction and the absence of corresponding completion documentation. He signed his name to it, his full credentials, his license number, his original inspector certification for the Callaway Tower project. He emailed it to Ward Ellison at 11:58 p.m. Then he sat in the truck and looked at his son sleeping. Jonah's mouth was slightly open. His inhaler had fallen off his belt loop and was lying on the seat. The dinosaur backpack had shifted and one of its straps was covering his face. Daniel reached back carefully and moved it. He thought about Karen. He thought about the apartment in Bridgeport, the bill in the kitchen drawer, the specialist appointment next month. He thought about walking into a lobby this morning with a worn log book and being handed to security. His phone buzzed. Ward Ellison, he answered. "I forwarded it to Renata," Ward said, "and to Margaret Song, and to Philip Hartley." "Okay. There's going to be a lot of questions tomorrow." "I know, Daniel," Ward's voice had something in it, something that hadn't been there when they'd met. "What you found tonight, that's real, that's a serious deficiency. If that building had gone through the build-out, you were looking at potential structural failure within 5 to 7 years. I know. You stopped that. I wrote a report." "You came back," Ward said. "You didn't have to, you're not getting paid for this. You drove out here at 10 at night with your kid asleep in the truck. You didn't have to do any of it." Daniel didn't say anything. "Get some sleep," Ward said. "Renata's going to call you in the morning." He hung up. Daniel sat there a while longer. Then he started the truck and drove home. You know what it's like to know something matters before anyone else does. Before the right people are in the room, before the documents line up, before the story gets told the way it actually happened. That's where we are right now, with Jonah asleep in the back and Daniel driving home through Chicago at midnight. If this story's landing with you, stay with it. What happens next is the part nobody saw coming. Renata Voss called at 7:45 in the morning. Daniel was making oatmeal. Jonah was still asleep. The kitchen window looked out at the street where a man was walking a very small dog on a very long leash, and Daniel had been watching them for 5 minutes the way you watch simple things when your brain is still processing complicated ones. He answered. "The seller knows," Renata said without preamble. "Someone on their side heard about the postponement and pulled the permit, records themselves. Their counsel called at 6 a.m. What did they say? They want to talk." A pause. "They're angry. They're claiming they had no knowledge of the deficiency. Do you believe them?" "I don't know yet." Another pause. "I believe they're genuinely surprised. Whether they were negligent or deliberately blind is a different question." "What does it mean for the deal?" "It means the deal is dead at $470 million. Her voice was controlled. "It may be dead entirely, or it may be restructured at a significantly lower price with indemnification provisions. Daniel waited. I wanted you to know, she said, that the structural report you submitted last night is being formally entered into the public record. The city's building department has been notified. An independent inspection will be required before the building can be approved for the planned renovations. That's good. It's a legal obligation, but yes, a beat. It's also the right thing. He could hear her moving, office sounds, her day already running. Ms. Voss. Daniel set the oatmeal off the burner. What happens to TechCore if the deal falls through? We lose a year of work and the acquisition cost we'd sunk in. We look for a different property. Her voice didn't waver. We survive. We've survived worse. And the seller, that's for their lawyers to answer. If they knew about the deficiency, they have serious exposure. If they didn't, they have a building problem to fix. And the people who work in the building now, the tenants. The city inspection will determine the risk level. Based on your report, the building is likely safe for current use at current load levels. The planned renovations will need to be re-evaluated once the deficiency is corrected. She paused. I've already spoken to the property manager. There will be no renovation approvals until the structural correction is complete and verified. Daniel sat down at the kitchen table. Thank you, he said. Renata was quiet for a moment. No, she said. Thank you. I owe you something. I'd like to have a formal conversation about that when you're ready. You don't owe me anything. I dismissed you publicly in front of your son. Her voice didn't apologize exactly, but it had weight in it. I was wrong, and in this industry, being wrong in the way I was wrong costs people things they can't get back. I got lucky that what it cost was time and money instead of something worse. It wasn't luck. You listened when Philip asked you to. I listened when Philip asked me to, she agreed. I should have listened when you asked me to. Daniel didn't argue that. Whenever you're ready, she said, we'll talk. The formal conversation happened 10 days later in a different conference room on a different floor. Jonah was not there. He was at school. Daniel had taken the bus. It was Renata, Philip Hartley, and Margaret Song, and it was simple. TechCore Capital, as a result of Daniel's findings, had avoided a $470 million acquisition of a structurally compromised asset. The financial exposure they'd escaped was significant. The legal exposure, had the deal closed and the deficiency surfaced during renovation, would have been worse. We'd like to compensate you for your work, Philip Hartley said, formally, as a consulting engagement. He named a number. Daniel looked at the figure on the paper in front of him. He thought about the bill in the kitchen drawer, about Jonah's specialist, about the apartment in Bridgeport and the truck with 140,000 miles on it. He thought about Corinne, about what she'd said near the end when he told her he was thinking about going back to inspection work. She'd smiled at him from the hospital bed and said, "You know you belong in those buildings. You see things other people walk right past." "That's generous," he said. "It's accurate," Philip said. "Based on our legal team's assessment of the exposure you helped us avoid, this is conservative." Daniel looked at the paper again, at the number. "I'd like to use part of it," he said, "for something specific." He didn't negotiate. He took what they offered. And what he wanted was simple: a structural safety education fund, administered through the city's engineering licensing board, for inspectors in underserved districts who couldn't afford the continuing education requirements to maintain their credentials. Because that was the gap. That was the thing that had let Daniel's own career stall, in part. The cost of keeping current while everything else in his life demanded money he didn't have. Renata Voss looked at him when he said it. "That's not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know, something for you." "This is for me," Daniel said, "in a different way." Philip Hartley wrote something down. Margaret Song made a note, and that was settled. That afternoon, Daniel picked Jonah up from school. Jonah came through the doors talking about a project on volcanoes and whether lava was technically a liquid or something in between a liquid and a solid. And did Daniel know that there were volcanoes on other planets, and had he ever thought about what it would be like to be a volcanologist? "No," Daniel said. "I hadn't thought about that. I've been thinking about it for most of today." Clearly. They walked to the bus stop. Jonah's backpack was very full, which meant he'd brought home too many library books again. "Dad," Jonah looked up at him, "did everything work out? Daniel had kept most of it from him. The logbook, the inspection, the report. Jonah knew his father had done something at a big building a few weeks ago that had involved being walked out by security and then, unexpectedly, not being walked out by security. "Yeah," Daniel said. "I think it did." "Did the building get fixed?" "It's going to get fixed. It'll take some time." Jonah thought about this. "Is it safer now, even before it gets fixed? The people inside aren't in immediate danger. They just can't do the renovation work they were planning until the problem's addressed." Daniel glanced down at him. "How do you know about all this?" "I heard you on the phone. You're supposed to be asleep when I'm on the phone that late." "I was almost asleep." Jonah shifted his backpack. "It's okay, Dad. I didn't tell anyone." "I know you didn't." They got on the bus. Jonah took the window seat because he always took the window seat. Chicago moved past them, streets, storefronts, people, the city's ordinary machinery grinding through another afternoon. After a while, Jonah said, "Did the lady learn her lesson?" "Which lady?" "The mean one from the big building." Daniel considered this carefully. "She wasn't mean," he said. "She was making fast decisions in a high-pressure situation, and she made the wrong one at first." Jonah processed this. "But then she made the right one." "Eventually, yeah, because Mr. Phillip made her. Phillip gave her space to change her mind." "Oh," Jonah watched a delivery truck pass. "I think that's important, that people can change their minds." Daniel felt something in his chest move. "Yeah," he said, "I think so too." 6 weeks after the Callaway Tower inspection, Ward Ellison called. "The remediation started," he said. "City approved the engineering plan Monday. Belfield Construction is not involved. New contractor, the correction will take about 3 months. Any pushback from the seller, their insurance carrier is going to cover most of the remediation cost. There's still litigation pending about who knew what and when, but that's going to take years to sort out." Ward paused. "Your report is in the center of all of it." "I know. You might get called as a witness." "I know that too. How's the kid?" Daniel looked through the window at the courtyard below their apartment building, where Jonah was crouched over something on the ground. He stayed very still for a long time. Then whatever he was looking at moved, and Jonah scrambled back fast and landed on his seat and then laughed. "He's good," Daniel said. "He's really good." "You going back to inspection work?" Ward asked. "Renata mentioned she might have a consulting arrangement to discuss." "We've talked about it, part-time to start." "I've got other commitments." "Good commitments?" "Yeah." Daniel watched Jonah stand up, dust off his jeans, go back to crouch over the thing again with slightly more caution. "The best ones." The children's specialist confirmed what Daniel had suspected. Jonah's asthma was manageable, would likely improve as he got older, and the medication they'd prescribed was working. The doctor shook Daniel's hand when they left and said, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." He was doing the same things he'd always done. Breakfast in the morning. School pickup in the afternoon. Handyman work in between. 4 clients who'd grown to 6 as word got around that Daniel Marsh was thorough and reliable and charged a fair rate. The white truck accumulated another few thousand miles. The apartment in Bridgeport was still small. The radiator still made noise. The kitchen drawer still had bills in it, though the balance on the largest one was getting smaller. 3 months after the Callaway Tower inspection, TechCore Capital completed its acquisition of a different property, a warehouse conversion in the Fulton Market District. Ward Ellison ran the due diligence. Daniel reviewed the structural reports on a consulting basis, flagged 2 things. Both were addressed before closing. Renata Voss sent him a brief email afterward. 2 words, "Thank you." He wrote back, "Good deal." It was a Saturday in January when Daniel took Jonah to see the Callaway Tower remediation work. Not because Jonah had asked. He'd asked about something else entirely. There was apparently a new exhibit at the Field Museum about deep-sea creatures, and Jonah had been asking about it for 2 weeks. But the Field Museum was on the south side, and the drive took them past the West Loop. And on an impulse Daniel had not entirely examined, he took the long way. He parked on a side street. Through the truck's windshield they could see the scaffolding on the building's northeast face, 6 through 9. The floors you couldn't see from here, really, there were too many other buildings. But you could see the workers moving up there in the pale January light and the equipment staged at the base of the structure and the careful, methodical quality of work being done right. Jonah looked at it. "Is that the building?" he asked. "One of them," That's Callaway Tower, the one I wrote the report about. Jonah looked at the scaffolding for a long time. What are they doing up there? Fixing the wall, Daniel said, making it what it was supposed to be in the first place. Jonah's breath fogged the window slightly. How long will it take? They've got another 6 weeks. And then it'll be safe. And then it'll be right. Daniel looked up at the scaffolding, at the workers moving carefully in the cold. Safe was what it always was. It just needed to be honest about it. Jonah thought about this. That's a weird thing to say about a building, he said. Maybe. But I kind of know what you mean. They sat for a while longer. The cold outside the truck was clean and still, the way January gets in Chicago when the wind stops and everything holds still for a minute. Dad, Jonah's voice was quiet. Yeah, I'm glad you kept the book. Daniel looked at the logbook sitting on the seat between them. He hadn't put it back in the glove compartment. Hadn't found the right time. Why's that? Because you wrote true things in it, Jonah said. And the true things turned out to matter. Daniel didn't say anything. He put the truck in drive. They went to the Field Museum and spent 2 hours in the deep sea exhibit, which was, according to Jonah, the best thing he'd ever seen, and which prompted an extended and detailed explanation of why anglerfish were technically both terrifying and admirable. Daniel agreed that they were. They ate hot dogs from the cart outside. Jonah got mustard on his coat and didn't notice. Daniel noticed and didn't say anything. On the way home, Jonah fell asleep in the passenger seat. Daniel drove through the city in the early evening dark, the lights coming on in windows, the river catching the reflection of everything. He thought about the log book. 247 entries. 11 years of work he'd tried to leave behind. He hadn't been able to. Because you signed your name to those buildings, Corinne had said, not that last year, not when she was sick, but years before, back when the work was new and everything still felt like possibility. You signed your name and that means something. Don't ever let it mean less than you intended. He hadn't intended it to. He just lost track of it for a while. You did that sometimes. Lost track of the things you'd meant to carry. And then something surfaced to remind you they were still there. An announcement on a radio in a truck. A number in an old log book. A building you'd once known every beam of. He pulled onto their street. Jonah stirred. Are we home? His voice was thick with sleep. Yeah. Jonah blinked at the window, at the streetlights, at the ordinary street where they lived their ordinary life. Good, he said. And that was everything that mattered. Not triumphant, not perfect. Not the life Daniel had mapped out before the years took the map and changed the territory. Just his son half asleep, one hand still loosely holding a museum pamphlet about deep-sea creatures. Just home, just this. He parked the truck, helped Jonah up the stairs, made them both tea, which Jonah didn't want but drank because Daniel had made it. And later, after Jonah was asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the logbook open to a clean page after page 41. He picked up a pen, and he started writing. Not a report, just notes. Things he'd noticed lately. A cracked foundation near a client's building on Halsted. A load pattern in a 3-flat in Bridgeport that someone was going to want to look at eventually. Things you signed your name to. Things that mattered. He wrote until the kitchen light was the only one on in the building, and the city outside the window was quiet, and his tea was cold, and the page was full. Then he closed the book, and rested his hand on the cover for a moment, and thought, there it is. The thing you carry forward when everything else falls away. Not the credential, not the title, not the career that looked the way it was supposed to look, just the work, just the care and the doing of it. Just the names you signed that mean what you intended them to mean. He turned off the light. In the morning, Jonah would wake up and want to talk more about anglerfish. In the morning, Daniel would have 3 calls to return and a job on the north side and a consulting report to finish. In the morning, the workers would go back to the scaffolding on Callaway Tower and keep doing the slow, careful work of making something right. But tonight was still, and still it held. Expansion Block Segment 3 Identity Depth. The FAA hadn't been easy to get into. Daniel had applied twice. The first time, he was 23 and fresh out of the engineering program, too young and too green, and carrying the kind of confidence that came from not having failed at anything important yet. The regional office in Chicago sent him a form letter that said thank you for your interest, and that was that. He got a job with Millbrook Structural Consulting, did 3 years of commercial building work, Learned what the drawings didn't tell you, the way experienced contractors cut corners not because they were dishonest, but because the timeline was impossible and the margin was thin, and everyone was hoping the tolerances would hold. He learned to tell the difference between hope and engineering. That difference had a name: variance. He applied to the FAA again at 26. This time they called him in. The interview was in a cinderblock office in a building near O'Hare that smelled like machine oil and bureaucratic patience. The man who interviewed him was named Crutchfield, 50-some, a former Navy engineer who'd spent 12 years doing exactly the kind of work Daniel was applying for. He looked at Daniel's consulting file for exactly 4 minutes. "You flagged 4 variance reports in 3 years, Crutchfield said. "Yes. 3 of them came back clean." "Yes. The 4th one, the parking structure on Ashland. You held the project for 2 weeks. The rebar density in the support columns was 11% below tolerance. In a parking structure with a design load for full commercial vehicles, that's not a margin you absorb and move on." Crutchfield had looked at him for a long moment. "The developer threatened to sue your firm." "He did." "Your firm asked you to revise the report." "They did." "You didn't." "I didn't." Crutchfield had set the file down and said, "You're hired." Daniel spent 11 years proving that decision was right. He ran 214 site inspections across Illinois, Indiana, and southern Wisconsin. He flagged 41 discrepancies. 38 were resolved without issue. 2 required extended project holds that cost developers money and caused him to be called things that would not have been printable in a trade journal. 1, the Lakewood Center job in 2011, went further than that. The contractor had poured 1 section of foundation before Daniel's inspection report came back. The rebar spacing was wrong, not egregiously wrong, but wrong. The contractor wanted to leave it, argued that the variance was within acceptable uncertainty. Produced his own engineering review suggesting the foundation would hold. Daniel had stood in the half-built structure and looked at the concrete already poured and said, "Tear it out." The contractor had laughed at him. Actually laughed. Daniel had gone to Crutchfield, who went to the regional director, who made 2 phone calls, and 3 days later the contractor had a city stop work order and a choice between demolishing the affected section or demolishing his relationship with federal oversight entirely. He tore it out. The building stood today on Chicago's north side, 44 stories, solid. Nobody knew that story. Nobody except the contractor, who still avoided industry events where Daniel might attend, and Crutchfield, who'd retired to Florida and sent Daniel a fishing photo every July without fail. That was the work that nobody saw. The decisions made in half-built structures by people whose names didn't appear in any press release, whose pictures didn't run in any trade magazine, whose authority existed in the gap between what a building claimed to be and what it actually was. Daniel had been good at that work, and then Karen got sick. The thing about grief was that it didn't announce itself as grief. Not at first. At first it was logistics. Hospital schedules and insurance filings, and trying to remember which pharmacy was in network. At first it was explaining to a 3-year-old where mommy was without using words that were too large for a 3-year-old to carry. Jonah hadn't understood. Not really. He was too young for understanding. What he'd understood was that sometimes Dad looked at him across the breakfast table with an expression Jonah couldn't name but could feel. Later, when he was old enough, he'd told Daniel, "You used to look at me like you were trying to memorize me." Daniel hadn't known how to respond to that because it was true. There'd been a period, probably 2 years, maybe 3, when every time he looked at Jonah, he was also looking at all the ways things could go wrong. The car ride to school, the playground, the asthma that had materialized when Jonah was 5, the first time he'd watched his son struggle for breath and felt the floor of the world tilt under his feet. He'd become a man who checked things, locks on doors, expiration dates on medication, tire pressure on the truck, and log books in the glove compartment that he hadn't opened in 7 years but couldn't bring himself to throw away. Expansion Block Segment 4 SDAKES. Jonah, the asthma specialist's office was on the 14th floor of a building near Rush University Medical Center. waiting room with foam-block toys in one corner and a fish tank in the other. Jonah always spent the time before his appointment with his face 2 inches from the tank, watching the fish move. "That one's slow," he'd said on the last visit. "Maybe it's tired," Daniel said. "Fish don't get tired." "How do you know?" "Because they live in water." Jonah considered this. "If I lived in water, I wouldn't be tired either." Dr. Reyes had been Jonah's specialist for 3 years. She was the 3rd doctor they'd tried. The first hadn't taken their insurance. The second had taken their insurance but had a waiting list of 8 months and an office that was 45 minutes away by bus. Dr. Reyes was 40 minutes by bus, accepted their insurance, and had on their first appointment crouched down to Jonah's level and asked him what the worst thing about his asthma was. Jonah had said, "The sound." Dr. Reyes had said, "What sound?" Jonah had said, "The sound I make when I can't breathe right. Dad gets scared when he hears it." Dr. Reyes had looked up at Daniel briefly, then back at Jonah. "Your dad is supposed to get a little scared," she'd said. "That means he's paying attention." Jonah had thought about this for a while. "Okay," he'd said finally, "but I still don't like the sound." "Me either," Dr. Reyes had said, "so let's make it happen less." The medications she'd prescribed had helped. The number of attacks Jonah had in the first year with Dr. Reyes was half of what it had been the year before. The bill for the first appointment had been $340 after insurance, which Daniel had paid in 2 installments. The second appointment, $280. Third appointment, $210. The insurance company had recategorized Jonah's condition, which had changed the coverage tier, which had changed the copay calculation, and none of this had been explained to Daniel until he was already at the front desk. He'd stood there with the bill and done the math in his head. He hadn't let himself do the math out loud. He'd said, "Can I do a payment plan?" The woman at the desk had looked at him with the practiced patience of someone who heard this request 4 times a day and felt genuine sorry about it every time. "Of course," she'd said. "We do that." He drove home with Jonah talking about the fish tank from the back seat, and he thought about Corinne, who had always been the one who managed the money, not because he was bad at it, but because she was better, and because those tasks had sorted themselves out naturally the way tasks do in a partnership that works. She'd known which bills to pay first and which vendors could wait and how to move money from one pocket to another without the whole structure collapsing. He'd learned that after she was gone. He'd learned it by making mistakes first. There was a year Jonah was 5. The asthma had just appeared, the apartment in Bridgeport was new, and the deposit had cleaned out the emergency account when Daniel had miscalculated badly. A gap between jobs. A client who paid 60 days late. An electricity bill that had climbed without him noticing because he'd been too tired to check. He'd sold the truck. The first truck, bought a cheaper one with higher miles. The client had eventually paid. The electricity had stayed on. The truck ran fine. But he'd looked at Jonah across the kitchen table that winter and thought, "I'm one wrong move away from being unable to take care of you." One wrong move. That thought had not left him. It had become something he carried. Not panic. Panic was too loud. This was quieter. A weight that sat in the chest and shaped every decision. The logbook was in the truck that winter. Still there. Still unread. The day Daniel found the announcement about the Callaway Tower acquisition, he'd been eating lunch in the newer truck, also white, also high mileage, but with functioning heat and a CD player that worked if you didn't try to change the disc too fast. He'd been parked outside a client's house in Woodlawn, waiting for a coat of caulk to dry before he could do the finish work on a window frame. The radio was on because silence made him think too much. The segment was 90 seconds. An anchor voice reading the summary of a Business Wire report. TechCore Capital Group announces agreement to acquire Callaway Tower Complex in Chicago's West Loop for $470 million. Due diligence period complete. Signing expected within 6 weeks. Development plans include tenant improvements across upper floors. Daniel had set down the sandwich, not because the number was large. Large numbers were announced on the radio all the time. Because of the words tenant improvements across upper floors. Because of the words due diligence period complete. He'd sat there for a while. Then he'd reached under the seat and pulled out the logbook from where it had lived for 11 years. rubber bands still in place, laminated safety cards still inside the front cover. He'd opened to page 41. He'd read his own handwriting from 11 years ago. The handwriting of a man who'd been 34, who'd just gotten the call that Corinne's tests had come back, who'd filled out this correction order on a Monday morning on the 8th floor of a building going up, and had told himself he'd follow up on the verification record just as soon as he'd figured out what the test results meant for their lives. He hadn't followed up. For 11 years, the page had sat here. He'd thought, somebody else caught it. Of course, somebody caught it. The building has been open 9 years. Somebody caught it. And then, sitting in the truck with the radio still going and the lunch getting cold, he'd thought, but what if they didn't? What if nobody caught it because the contractor billed for work they didn't do and the original inspector left, and the building got its certificate and opened and 9 years passed, and the numbers looked fine until someone decided to do tenant improvements on the upper floors and the load pattern changed? What if? He'd looked at the glove compartment. He'd thought about Jonah's specialist appointment next month, the bill in the kitchen drawer, the truck that needed new front tires before February. He'd thought about putting the logbook back. He'd sat there a long time thinking about it. Then he'd taken out his phone and called TechCore Capital's main line. Expansion block segment 5 escalation plus mid-story complication. The 3 weeks between that phone call and the morning Daniel walked into TechCore's lobby were not quiet weeks. The first call was easy to dismiss. He'd asked for the acquisition team and been transferred to a voicemail box belonging to someone named Kevin. He'd left a message explaining what he had and why it mattered. He was specific. He gave the building, the floors, the reference number. He said he was a licensed inspector with documented findings and that he'd like to speak with someone before the signing. Kevin did not call back. Daniel tried a different number the next day. This time he reached a live person in the legal department who told him that due diligence was complete and that any third-party concerns about the acquisition should be submitted in writing to the compliance team. He submitted it in writing. Email. Clear subject line. He attached a photo of page 41. No response. He called the main line again and asked specifically for the compliance team. He was transferred. He got voicemail. He left a message. He sent a follow-up email. He found the name of TechCore's head of acquisitions in a press release about a deal that had closed the previous year. He sent that person an email. No response. He found an article mentioning Renata Voss in Cranes. Sent a message to the general CEO inbox with the word urgent in the subject line and a clear explanation of the issue. Nothing. The signing was in 6 days. He called Rodrigo. Rodrigo was his former colleague from the FAA days, the man who'd eventually lent him the inspection equipment, but that came later. This first call was different. This call was to ask whether Daniel was, in Rodrigo's assessment, overreacting. "Read me the entry," Rodrigo said. Daniel read it over the phone. Silence. "What does the verification record look like?" Rodrigo asked. "I can't find one in the public filings. I've checked the city permit system twice. Maybe it's misfiled. It's possible. Buildings like that, they get sold and bought and the records get shuffled." Rodrigo's voice was careful, not dismissive but measured. 9 years of occupancy without incident is evidence. It's evidence that the structural margins were sufficient for the existing load pattern. If someone goes in there and renovates floors 6 through 9 for a different tenant use and the load distribution changes, the margins change too. You going to contact them in person? I've been trying to contact them for 2 weeks. They're not listening. Then yeah, you go in person. A pause. You sure about this? You've been out of the game a while. You're going to walk into a major acquisition on the day of signing and tell them the building might not pass muster. That's a big swing. I know. What does the math say? Daniel looked at the page in front of him. He'd run the numbers twice. It says there's a real possibility the corrective work was never done. That doesn't mean the building is about to fail. It means there's an unverified gap in the safety record of an asset someone is about to pay $470 million for. Then tell them that, Rodrigo said. Exactly that. No hedging. No softening. Tell them what you don't know, and what the risk of not knowing is. What if they don't listen? Then you've done what you could. Rodrigo's tone shifted slightly. And you'll sleep at night. Daniel sat with that for a moment. He'd done what he could. He'd done what he could for 11 years with Corinne. He'd done what he could with the apartment, with the truck, with the bills, with Jonah's asthma and the specialist and the payment plans. He was very tired of doing what he could and having it be not quite enough. But sometimes not quite enough was still more than nothing. "Okay," he said. "I'll go in person." "Take the logbook," Rodrigo said. "Physical documentation always lands harder than email." The mid-story complication arrived at 8 o'clock on the evening of the inspection, when Ward Ellison pulled Daniel aside on the 8th floor of Callaway Tower, away from the section of wall they'd just opened. Ward Ellison was looking at his phone. "I just got a call from Owen Marsh," he said. Daniel went still. Owen Marsh. His former supervisor at the FAA. Not a relative, same last name, different family, a coincidence that had caused exactly one awkward moment in their working relationship and had never come up again. "He saw your name in the filing we put in today," Ward said. "He called me." "What did he say?" Ward looked at him steadily. "He said he remembers you. He said the Callaway Tower project went sideways at the end because your wife was sick and you weren't fully present in those final months. He said there's a possibility the flag on page 41 wasn't a structural finding. He said it was possible it was a paperwork error made by someone under personal stress." Daniel looked at him. "He said what?" "He said he's willing to make a statement that the original correction order may have been issued in error." Ward's voice was careful, neutral, not taking a side yet. He said the load calculations from the original design were already conservative, and that the variance you flagged may have been within acceptable tolerance if interpreted differently. Daniel stood in the opened wall section of the 8th floor of a building he'd spent 18 months inside, 11 years ago, and thought about Owen Marsh. Owen Marsh, who'd been his supervisor for 5 of those 11 years, who'd signed off on 3 of Daniel's most significant escalation reports, who'd told him in the parking lot of a regional conference in 2013 that he was the best inspector in the district and that he should be angling for the regional director position when it opened up. Owen Marsh, who'd been the one to approve Daniel's leave of absence when Corinne got sick. Owen Marsh, who'd sent a card to the funeral, and who was now why? "Do you know why he's doing this?" Daniel asked. Ward was quiet for a moment. "His consulting firm has a contract with Halloway Bryant's successor entity," Ward said. "They took over Halloway Bryant's project portfolio when the company dissolved. Owen Marsh's firm has done compliance verification work for them for 3 years. Silence. Daniel looked at the wall, at the concrete that was where reinforced concrete should have been. "He knows what we found tonight," Daniel said. "I think he does, or he knows there's a risk we'd find it. And if we find it, it traces back to Halloway Bryant, which traces back to the successor entity, which is his client. That's my read." Ward looked at him. "He's not going to back your findings. He's going to challenge them. And he has institutional credibility. He ran the regional FAA office for 9 years. If he submits a statement saying your original flag was a stress-induced error by a distracted inspector, that creates enough ambiguity for the deal to move forward." Daniel stood very still. This was the thing. This was always the thing that didn't fit in the clean version of the story. The opposition didn't come from nowhere. It came from somewhere. From someone who had reasons that made sense to them. From someone who'd been decent once and had found a position where decency was expensive. Owen Marsh wasn't a villain. He was a man with a client and a conflict of interest and a call to make. "I can't fix his call," Daniel said. "I can only stand on what I found." "That's where you are," Ward said. "Whatever you file, he's going to contest it. It's going to be your credibility versus his. He's a regional FAA director emeritus. I'm a handyman in Pilsen. Yes, that's not a favorable comparison." "No." Daniel looked at the core sample lying on the floor beside the opened wall. "Is the sample enough?" he asked. "Without my credibility, just the physical evidence, is it enough?" Ward looked at it. He crouched, ran his hand along the edge of it. "If there's a question about whether the original flag was legitimate," he said slowly, "then the sample and the photographic record become the primary evidence. Your logbook becomes corroborating rather than definitive." He stood. "With your credibility contested, the standard for what constitutes proof goes up. How much higher? You'd need the original Belfield construction records. not just the invoices from Holloway Bryant. The actual execution records from Belfield, what they ordered, what they received, what they physically did on those floors. Belfield dissolved. Their principals didn't. Someone ran that company. Someone made the decision to invoice for work that wasn't done if that's what happened. Ward looked at him. I can try to find them. It'll take time. How much time? Days, maybe a week. The signing was tomorrow. Daniel sat down on the floor of the 8th floor of Callaway Tower and looked at the core sample and thought. Owen Marsh was going to make a call. And Daniel Marsh, no relation, different family, same last name, was going to have to be enough without anyone else standing behind him. He thought about Crutchfield, retired to Florida, fishing photos every July. He thought about page 41. He thought about what it meant to sign your name to something. Then he picked up the phone. Expansion Block Segment 6, the quiet plan plus allies, he called Rodrigo. Rodrigo answered on the second ring, which meant he was still awake, which meant he was watching baseball with the sound off the way he always did. It's me, Daniel said. I know it's you. What happened? Did you get in? We got in. We did the inspection. We found what I thought we'd find. Daniel looked at the wall. Owen Marsh is challenging my original findings. He's going to say the correction order was a stress-induced error. A long pause. Owen's consulting for Holloway Bryant's successor. Yes, son of a Rodrigo stopped himself. Okay, what do you need? The Belfield construction principals, the company that was supposed to do the corrective work. They dissolved, but whoever was running that company is still somewhere. I need their execution records. What they actually did on site in October and November 2013. That's a lot to find before tomorrow morning. I know. Give me the company registration number if you have it. Daniel had it. He'd looked it up the day he tracked down the archives. He gave Rodrigo the number. I'll make some calls, Rodrigo said. My neighbor's kid is an investigator with the city building department, used to work for the AG's office. If there's a contractor fraud trail, she'll know how to pull it. Rodrigo, don't thank me yet. Go finish your report. Send it to Ward. Document everything you found tonight to the inch. Owen's statement could be enough to create doubt. Maybe, but Owen's statement is one man saying a thing. Your core sample is a physical object that doesn't change its story. Rodrigo's voice was flat and sure. Trust the object. Objects don't have conflicts of interest. Daniel looked at the core sample again. Yeah, he said, okay. And Daniel, what? You're not distracted now. He sat with that for a moment. No, he said, I'm not. He spent the next 2 hours writing. The report was 14 pages. Photographic evidence with scale references, measurements, chain of custody for the core sample, cross-reference to the original correction order, the materials invoices, the absence of the completion record. He wrote it the way he'd always written them, factual, referenced, specific. No conclusion that the evidence didn't support. No claim beyond what the documentation proved. He signed it at 11:43 p.m. He sent it to Ward. And then he sat in the truck beside Jonah's sleeping form and opened a blank page in the back of the logbook and started writing something he hadn't written in 11 years. Notes. Not a report. Not a formal filing. Just notes the way he used to take them in the field, observations, questions, things he'd noticed that didn't fit into categories yet. The way the concrete sample had fractured. The age of the existing rebar in the surrounding section. The moisture pattern at the base of the wall that suggested something about water ingress that wasn't in any of the documents. He wrote for an hour. When he stopped, he had 6 pages of notes. He looked at them. Then he called Ward again. The moisture pattern at the base of the wall, Daniel said without preamble. Did you photograph it? The discoloration on the lower section. Yes. That's not just age. That's water intrusion that's been going on for years. The original design had a vapor barrier at that wall. If the corrective work wasn't done, the vapor barrier wasn't re-established either. Silence. So you're not just looking at a structural deficiency, Ward said slowly. You're looking at a structural deficiency plus years of moisture ingress that's been working on the concrete, which accelerates degradation, which changes the timeline. Yes, Daniel looked at his notes. Whatever load tolerance was in the original margin design, it's been degraded by moisture for 9 years. The tipping point for failure under renovation load conditions isn't 5 to 7 years out. How far out? I'd need to run the models, but the moisture evidence suggests it's closer. A long pause. "I'll call Margaret's song," Ward said. "It's midnight. I know what time it is." A pause. "Daniel, Owen Marsh is going to be hard to counter on the original finding, but this is new evidence. This is something he doesn't know you have, and it's documented tonight independently separate from your 11-year-old flag. It supports the original finding, it doesn't replace it. No, but if someone asks why the structural deficiency matters even if the original flag is contestable, you hand them the moisture data. Current, independent, irrefutable." Daniel looked at the page in front of him. "Okay," he said, "get some sleep." "I will." He didn't. He sat in the truck until nearly 2 in the morning running numbers, cross-referencing the moisture evidence with load models he worked out on the back pages of the logbook using formulas he hadn't used in 7 years. Formulas that came back to him the way things did when they were part of you, not like memory, more like posture. At 2:15, Jonah shifted in the back seat, made a small sound. Didn't wake up. Daniel set down the pen. He sat there in the dark truck, outside a West Loop building that didn't know it had a problem, and he thought, this is what you do with the years you carry. You carry them until they're needed, and then you use them. By morning, Rodrigo had called back. He'd reached his neighbor's kid, who'd known someone who'd worked at the AG's office during a contractor fraud investigation in 2015 that had touched Belfield construction peripherally. Not a prosecution. A referral that went nowhere because the primary targets were bigger fish. But there were records. The Belfield principals were 2 men, a Thomas Greer and a Marcus Alden. Greer was deceased, 2020. Alden was alive, 64, living in Rockford, working for a small commercial construction firm. Rodrigo's contact had found a witness statement from Alden in the 2015 referral files. In it, Alden had described a pattern at Belfield Construction of billing for subcontracted correction work and pocketing the subcontractor's fee when the client didn't follow up on the verification. The statement wasn't directly about Callaway Tower, but it established a documented pattern, and it put a human name to the story. When Ward took this to Margaret Song at 7 a.m., she took it to Renata Voss at 7:15, and Renata Voss called Owen Marsh at 7:30. Daniel was told about this call secondhand by Ward, who'd been in the room. By all accounts, Renata's voice had been precise, without anger and entirely without softness. She'd said, "We have documentation of a contractor fraud pattern from the principals involved in the corrective work on this building. We have current independent evidence of moisture damage at the affected wall. We have a licensed inspector's report from last night. And I have a question for you." She'd given him a moment. Then she'd said, "Which would you prefer, to withdraw your statement now or to appear on record as having contested findings that 3 independent evidence streams confirm?" Owen Marsh had withdrawn his statement by 8 o'clock. He had not apologized. Daniel hadn't expected him to. The quiet plan in the end was not dramatic. It was exactly what Daniel had been doing his whole career without calling it by any name. Look at the thing. Look at it completely. Write down what you see. Sign your name to it. The difference this time was that people were watching. Expansion Block Segment 7 Confrontation and Reveal Deepening. The full board meeting happened at 10 a.m. Daniel was not invited to this one. He sat in a waiting area on the 36th floor with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and Jonah's latest drawings. Jonah was at school now. Mrs. Patterson, who lived in their building, had agreed to take him for the morning. Another debt of gratitude Daniel added to the list he kept spread on the seat beside him for no reason, except that he'd grabbed them from the kitchen table that morning, and having them with him made the waiting easier. He'd been sitting there for 40 minutes when Philip Hartley appeared in the doorway. "Come in," Philip said. The boardroom was larger than the conference room Daniel had been in the day before. It was designed for a certain kind of event, the kind where a lot of money was decided. Long table, 14 seats, all of them occupied. The windows looked out on the river again. A gray Chicago November outside. Renata Voss was at the head of the table. She looked like someone who'd been awake since 4 and had already won 2 arguments before anyone else was out of bed. The board members, Daniel counted 11, looked like people who were in the middle of losing an argument and were deciding how they felt about it. Kevin Aldrich sat at the far end with a laptop open, and an expression that said he would very much rather not be here. Margaret Song was at a separate table against the wall with 3 junior attorneys, all typing. And at the center of the main table, Ward Ellison's structural report, Daniel's report, with Ward's verification, was on a screen large enough for everyone in the room to read simultaneously. One of the board members, a heavy-set man in his 60s with the bearing of someone who'd come up through investment banking, was speaking when Daniel entered. The seller's position is that if we can't close within 72 hours, they're pulling the asset and relisting. We've already pushed the timeline once. There's no goodwill left. We can't close with an unresolved structural deficiency, Renata said. The deficiency is disputed. It was disputed as of last night. It stopped being disputed at 8 this morning when Owen Marsh withdrew his statement. Her voice was patient. She'd already had this argument and won it, and now she was explaining to the room why the argument was over. We have a licensed inspector's documented findings, physical evidence, a moisture damage assessment, and documented fraud patterns from the original contractor. The deficiency is real. Or we're being played, the heavy-set man said. Someone found out about the building issue and is using it to drive the price down. If we walk away, this building goes on market and someone else buys it for $520 million after they do a proper fix. Then they'll do a proper fix first. Can't do while negotiating acquisition. We could condition the purchase. On what? Renata's voice was precise. On the seller guaranteeing work is performed on a building they're about to sell us. That's not how it works. The heavy-set man sat back. He wasn't satisfied, but he was out of arguments. Another board member, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and the careful posture of someone who'd been watching rather than talking, spoke quietly. What does Mr. Marsh recommend? Everyone in the room looked at Daniel. He hadn't expected to speak. He thought he was here to stand in the room and be a physical confirmation of the findings on the screen. He looked at the board member. The building needs the corrective work completed before the acquisition closes, he said. Not after, not contingent, before. That delays the deal by months. If the seller won't accept that condition, then the seller is asking you to own a liability. It's a manageable liability. For a building in its current use, yes. For a building undergoing the tenant renovations in the development plan, no. Daniel kept his voice level. He was standing in front of 14 people who made decisions that moved more money in an hour than he'd moved in his entire career. He noticed this, and then he let it go, because it was not relevant. The moisture evidence changes the timeline for degradation. My initial estimate was 5 to 7 years under renovation load. With 9 years of moisture ingress factored in, I can't stand behind that estimate. How long? I don't know, that's why I won't commit to it. You won't commit to a timeline. I won't commit to a timeline I can't support with data. You can find someone who will, but their commitment won't make the building any safer. Silence. Renata was watching him. Something in her expression was different from the lobby yesterday. Not warmer exactly, but different. Like she'd seen a kind of thing before, but not this particular version of it, and was recalibrating. What would you do? She asked. In your position? Yes, Daniel thought about it. I'd tell the seller we need the structural remediation completed and verified before close, and I'd offer to pay half the cost as an adjustment to the purchase price. He looked around the table. If the seller is clean, if they genuinely didn't know about the Belfield fraud, they'll want the building fixed as much as you do. The liability exposure if someone gets hurt is theirs until the sale closes. They have no incentive to fight this. The room was quiet. Philip Hartley, who had been sitting at the far end of the table and had not spoken, made a single note on the legal pad in front of him. Then he looked up at Renata. Make the call, he said. Renata called the seller's counsel from a conference room off the main boardroom while Daniel waited outside. She was in there for 32 minutes. He counted. When she came out, her expression was the same, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. They agreed, she said, to the remediation condition, to everything, cost sharing, timeline, independent verification before close. She looked at Daniel steadily. They were furious, by the way. The seller wants to know who found this and how. And I told them a former FAA inspector walked in off the street because he couldn't get anyone to return his phone calls. A pause. Their counsel went very quiet for a moment. Daniel didn't say anything. The seller also wants to pursue the Belfield principals civilly, Renata said. Marcus Alden is going to have a very interesting year. He should. Yes, she looked at him directly now. The assessment was still there, it never really left, but the quality of it had changed. I dismissed you in my lobby, in front of your son. You made a reasonable call with the information you had. I made a fast call because I was under pressure and you looked like a disruption. Her voice didn't waver. Those aren't the same thing. Daniel didn't argue with that either. What would you have done, he asked, if Philip hadn't been in the lobby? She was quiet for a moment. I'd like to say I would have stopped, she said, but I honestly don't know. She looked away briefly, at the window, at the gray river below. That bothers me more than the deal does. The revelation detonated quietly, the way the real ones do. Not in the boardroom, not when the page was read, but in this hallway with two people standing in the aftermath of what had almost happened. Renata Voss had built a company, had clawed space in rooms full of people who didn't expect her to be there, had made decisions at $470 million scale with the calibrated certainty of someone who couldn't afford to be wrong. She had almost been very wrong. Because a man in a coffee-stained jacket with a handwritten logbook couldn't get his phone calls returned. I'm going to change how we handle third-party filings, she said. Anyone who claims documented safety findings about an asset in active acquisition gets a direct line to counsel, not a compliance inbox, not a voicemail tree. She looked back at him. I should have had that already. Probably. That's not an argument. No, Daniel said. It's a fact. The corners of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something drier than that. You're not what I expected, she said. You're not what I expected either. A pause. What did you expect? I expected you to double down, Daniel said. A lot of people in your position would have fought harder to protect the deal, called lawyers, found a reason the findings were inadmissible, made the problem into a credibility question. I thought about it. I know. Philip stopped me. Philip gave you a moment to think. You stopped yourself. She looked at him for a long beat. Then she said, the structural fund, the one you're asking us to establish. Yes. It's going to be named after your wife, she said. The announcement will say that. I made that decision 10 minutes ago. Daniel hadn't expected that. He stood there for a moment. Then he said quietly, thank you. Expansion block segment 8 karma payoff specifics. The consequences arrived in stages, the way consequences do when the wrongdoing took years to build. Marcus Alden was the first. The Belfield construction fraud, as it turned out, was not limited to Callaway Tower. The pattern Owen Marsh had half known and fully avoided was broader than anyone had initially understood. The City Building Department's investigation, opened within a week of Daniel's report becoming public record, identified 5 other projects in the 2011 to 2016 window where Belfield had invoiced for corrective work, and either performed it partially or not at all. 3 of those 5 projects had already been sold and resold and redeveloped without anyone catching the gap. Were still in the hands of original owners who now faced the kind of surprise that made corporate lawyers stop eating lunch. Marcus Alden was charged in federal district court with 7 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of filing false compliance documents, and 1 count of conspiracy. His bail was set at $200,000. He posted it. He was required to surrender his contractor's license in 4 states. His co-principal, Thomas Greer, deceased, was beyond the reach of law. But his estate was not beyond the reach of civil litigation, and 3 of the affected building owners had already filed suit by the time December arrived. Owen Marsh, for his part, faced no criminal charges. He had not committed a crime. What he'd done was call in a favor for a client and withdraw it when confronted with overwhelming evidence. The Ethics Review Board for his professional certification received a formal complaint, filed by Ward Ellison in his personal capacity. The review would take 6 months. The outcome was not Daniel's to determine, but the consulting contract between Owen Marsh's firm and the Halloway Bryant successor entity was terminated 14 days after he withdrew his statement. Daniel learned this from Rodrigo, who had learned it from his neighbor's kid, who had no obligation to know this and had found out anyway because she was the kind of person who followed threads until they ended. He's going to be fine, Rodrigo had said. People like Owen Marsh are always fine. "I know," Daniel had said. "Does that bother you?" Daniel had thought about it. "It used to," he said. "Now I think I just want to do my work and go home." Rodrigo had laughed. It was a good laugh, the kind that came from knowing someone a long time. "That's what growing up looks like," Rodrigo said. "I'm 45. Some people take longer." The Callaway Tower remediation was awarded to a contractor named Precision Structural Group, a woman-owned firm out of Evanston with a clean record and the kind of attention to documentation that Daniel approved of on principle. He'd reviewed their methodology before the contract was signed, at Ward's request, in a capacity that was officially consulting and unofficially the beginning of something. The remediation took 14 weeks. Every week, Ward sent Daniel a progress report. Not because he was required to, because Daniel had asked. He read each one at the kitchen table after Jonah was in bed. On week 9, the report noted that the vapor barrier had been re-established and that the initial moisture assessment showed improvement. On week 12, the structural reinforcement was verified complete and load tests were being scheduled. On week 14, Ward signed off. The verification record was filed with the City Building Department under reference number B 2013-4471-NE. Correction order, closed. 31 years late. Daniel's name was not on the final verification. He hadn't been asked to be and he hadn't offered. The verification belonged to the inspector who did the work in 2024. That was correct. That was how the system was supposed to operate. But his name was on the original flag. And the original flag was why any of this had happened. The acquisition closed in the spring. $412 million. The adjusted price reflected the cost of the remediation. The seller, in the end, had been Clean, a property management company that had inherited the building through a series of secondary transactions, and had bought it in good faith, with a due diligence report that hadn't caught what Daniel caught because no one in their due diligence chain had known to look for a missing verification record under a specific reference number in a contractor's archived documents. The property management company's CEO made a public statement about their commitment to rigorous standards and thorough documentation review. Renata Voss, asked about the deal at a Cranes roundtable in March, said this: "We almost made a $470 million mistake. We didn't because one person, someone with no institutional backing, no financial interest, and no remaining obligation to the industry, came to our lobby with 11 years of documentation and refused to leave until someone listened. That's a structural failure on our side, not his. We've changed how we handle third-party safety filings because of it. We should have done it years ago." The Cranes journalist had asked for the person's name. Renata had looked at the journalist for a moment. Then she'd said, "His name is Daniel Marsh. He lives in Bridgeport and he fixes things for a living." The article had run that Thursday. Daniel read it on his phone in the truck during a lunch break. He set the phone down and looked at the street for a while. Then he finished his lunch and went back to work.